Alright, peace to everybody that's watching this video. This is part 1 of a 3 to 4 part series. The title should be self-explanatory, but just to give you a full list of everything I'm going to be speaking about is how the European was the first to classify humans as races and colors, how there is no such thing as a black or white person, and how labeling people as colors and races is indeed a caste system. I'm going to be explaining the true definition of the word black and why you should never use that word to describe anything. I will be giving alternatives to the word black because I comprehend that the so-called color that we erroneously call black is indeed sacred and of great importance to us, but you must realize that calling it black is disrespectful to what it represents and stands for. I'm going to speak about the basic psychology of why people still call themselves blacks and African Americans and why they defend using these words. For all my Moors out there, I got important information that proves that we are ancient and connected to all ancient cultures like Egypt, Babylonia, Persia, Chaldea, and that the word Moor is indeed an original word by us. I'm going to speak about the Moors of the Pacific Islands, and yes, those statues of the Easter Island Moai are indeed Moors. I'm going to prove that we are indigenous to all continents, including Asia, Europe, and the Americas, of course. I'm going to also speak about how our DNA actually proves that we were in the Americas for thousands of years, while also debunking these so-called African American DNA tests that supposedly say we are descendants of slaves from West Africa. You know what I'm saying? It's absolute BS, and I'm gonna prove it. Like I said, this is going to be a 3 to 4 part video series, so make sure you watch all of it because I'm going to be dropping some essential information. And of course, take notes and do your own research as always, and thanks for watching. Peace. Alright, to start off the video, you got to comprehend these basic and important facts about so-called race. The European is the first to establish the concept of classifying humans as races and colors. The concept of race was created as one of the many tools, and perhaps the greatest tool used by the European to colonize not only the planet but our minds. Race and color are literal brandings, basically the same way you would brand an animal or livestock, right? Brands are used by Europeans in positions of power to divide the human family as if we were some different species or breeds of dogs or something. This point right here is extremely important. When someone asks you what color are you, they are asking what race are you, right? Color is synonymous with race and is the same thing as race and has absolutely nothing to do with your actual skin tone, because color and race are artificial constructs. Race is used by the European to declare the geographical range of said races. For example, to brand someone as black and Negro is to bind them to Africa, and more specifically sub-Saharan Africa. Therefore, people who are branded as African Americans and blacks are bound to Africa, even though they are the original Americans, which forfeits their birthright in history as the original Americans, right? Scientists and biologists now know that it's impossible to classify race because of the fact that the so-called black race is the most genetically diverse and can have any phenotype, and it's impossible to classify human diversity. The number of races and how they are classified vary greatly depending on which European anthropologist you are studying at the time, right? I don't really remember who first brought up this metaphor. I think it was Brother Phil Valentine, I believe, who said this. But someone compared the European to a dog who urinates to mark his territory. So, you know, the European classifies humans. He brands us with colors and races. And, you know, that's his form of marking his territory. Naming countries, creating borders other than those that were created by the indigenous peoples is marking his territory and branding those indigenous peoples and indigenous lands. The first people and the earliest people to classify race and the earliest anthropologists were either monogenicists, who proposed that all humans come from one origin, such as Adam and Eve or whatever, or they were polygenicists like Christophe Mainers, who also, I believe, helped create the term Caucasian or Caucasoid. Polygenicists proposed that human races originated from different sources, as in we are completely different species from each other. All these early anthropologists and the first creators of race were basically eugenicists, because they all declared that the European, the Caucasoid, the Albinoid, the white race, as being the archetype, the original man, and they were the most beautiful of all races, and that all other races were basically degenerate or devolved forms of the Caucasoid, and that developing melanin, right? Listen to this. Developing melanin was a sign of degeneration or de-evolution. To give you just a few names of these so-called scientists who basically helped develop this nonsense we call race would be Francis Galton, the founder of eugenics, who is also the cousin of Charles Darwin, Christophe Meiners, Alice Hardlicka, Carlton S. Kuhn, Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, who came up with the idea of the so-called Aryan master race, Franz Boas, known as the father of American anthropology. You know what I'm saying? That's just a few of the Europeans who basically caused a great deal of confusion and helped to divide the human family into basically denationalize us. Probably the two most influential people when it comes to developing a system of race and color would have to be Johann Blumenbach and Carl Linnaeus. Today's racial terms and the colors that are branded onto these races pretty much come from these two people, Blumenbach and Linnaeus. Blumenbach pretty much helped create the Caucasian or the Caucasoid and branded them with the color white. Mongolian or Mongoloids were branded with the color yellow. Malayans, which would now be classified as Australoids, were branded with the color brown. And Ethiopians or Negroids were branded with the word black and Negro and the color that we think is black. And the fifth race are the Native Americans, branded with the color red. Linnaeus had 4 races, but still branded them with the same colors, white, what we call black, yellow, and red. You know, a lot of times some anthropologists consider there to only be about 3 main races: Negroid, Caucasoid, and Mongoloid. And Native Americans would be considered Mongoloid. And there are a bunch of other sub-races that branch off from the 3 main races. Just to simplify things as much as possible, I'm going to just go through a list of the main racial categories and their synonyms that are used today. Right? The Caucasian race, which is synonymous with Caucasoid, Europoid, white. Some sub-races of Caucasoid would be the Alpine, Nordic, Mediterranean, and Arabid or Arab. Negroid, which is synonymous with Ethiopian, Africoid, Congoloid, Sub-Saharan African, and Black African. And you also have the so-called pygmy races or pygmoids, which are separated into the negritos or negritoids, which is a diminutive word in Spanish referring to the so-called little blacks of Asia. Another pygmy race would be the negrillos or negriloids, which is diminutive for the so-called little blacks of Africa. Then you have the Melanesians, the Micronesians, and the Polynesians of the Pacific Islands, and depending on the anthropologists, these groups may be considered to be Australoids, Negritos or Negroes, or Mongoloid, or even a mixture of all 3 of these. In 1962, Carlton S. Kuhn classified the Khoisan of South Africa as a whole other race separate from the Negroid, which was branded as the Capoid race. Synonyms for the Capoids would be the Khoisanid, the Hottentot, such as the Hottentot Venus, and the Bushman. And then there's another race known as the Ethiopid, which I think was also created by Carlton S. Kuhn, which has absolutely nothing to do with Blumenbach's Ethiopian or Africoid race. The Ethiopid is referring to the peoples of the Horn of Africa, like the Somalians and the Eritreans, and they are actually classified as being Caucasoids or of white stock. And it's a lot more races and sub-races, but that's just to illustrate how confusing these racial classifications are, because they are all dependent upon which particular anthropologist made these races and how that particular anthropologist chooses to classify them. You can look at this map of the human race distribution by Carlton S. Kuhn. The Mongoloids are shown as blue, which includes Native Americans. The Congoloid, Africoid, or Negroid is yellow. the Australoid is shown as pink, the Khoisan or Capoids are shown in purple, and the Caucasian or Caucasoid is shown in green. And look at how much of the map is shown in green, right? He branded all of North Africa and the Horn of Africa, or the Ethiopids, as being Caucasoid. One more map that illustrates the three main races and their geographical location would be the Myers Conversations, a Lexicon, Encyclopedia, which only shows three races and their sub-races and includes Australoids and Dravidians as being part of the Negroid race. I want to prove to you why these words like Caucasoid and Negroid and their corresponding colors are nothing more than brands with absolutely no basis in reality, and why these brands make no sense whatsoever. You know what I'm saying? Like I said, the brand Negroid or a true Negro is an attempt to discredit the genetic diversity of the so-called black race and to bind us only to sub-Saharan Africa. You know what I'm saying? They don't tell you about the so-called Negroids who lived in North Africa still. They don't tell you about how the so-called Negroid was found in the Americas and Asia for thousands of years ago. So this is why they never show you the diversity and the geographical range that we have, because there really is no geographical range for us. Like a few years ago, I never even knew people like the Papua New Guineans or the Solomon Islanders or the Anomanis, the Jarawa, or the Tasmanians existed. I never knew these people existed. Saying we know why the public isn't taught about these people, because it's obvious that those people didn't get there by way of no African slave trade, right? And it makes people really question, why aren't we taught about these people who may look like Africans but they ain't Africans, right? Once you realize that we can produce straight hair, blonde and red hair, blue and green eyes, thin lips and thin noses naturally without any Caucasoid admixture, you will realize that there is no such thing as a Caucasoid phenotype or facial feature. People like the Dravidians and the East Africans, who all get branded as being Caucasoid or Caucasians, they had these phenotypes long before the European ever came into existence. Caucasoid is a brand because the European bases it solely on appearances. It's one of his ways of laying claim to ancient Egypt and the ancient cultures of the so-called Middle East, like Babylonia and Chaldea, who were all original peoples like the ancient Egyptians. Branding someone as Caucasian, even though they are indigenous Africans with no Caucasoid or European admixture, is a psychological trigger, right? Because when a person who is ignorant and doesn't have any real knowledge about history, when they hear that someone looks or appears Caucasian or Caucasoid, their subconscious mind already associates Caucasian and Caucasoid with white and European. Look at this image. Only one of these men is a true Arab, just like only one could be a true Egyptian, right? The European will brand both of these individuals as being Caucasoid and will say that it makes these men racially related somehow. You know what I'm saying? They will also attempt to tell you that the reason why the true Arab on the left looks the way he does is because he is mixed with the DNA of the man on the right, which is incorrect. I'm saying they make you believe that the pale-skinned individual on the right had those phenotypes, thin lips, thin noses, before the individual on the left, therefore making the true dark-skinned Arab a descendant of Europeans and pale-skinned quadroon Arabs, when in reality the darker-skinned true Arabs had those phenotypes long before the European ever existed. It's the same exact thing with this image. Anthropologists will classify both of these individuals with the brand Caucasoid, and will have you believe that the darker skinned Indian on the left has his facial features because of the European on the right, when in reality the Indian had those facial features long before the European. I'm saying it's just a brand used to confuse people and make us believe that there is actually a thing known as the white race or the Caucasian race. I'm saying whether you think the European is a failed scientific experiment, a creation of Yakub, grafted from apes or monkeys, whether they are genetically modified organisms, you know what I'm saying? How did this large amount of mutations manifest on the planet? I don't even know. But what I can say is that they are an expression of our most recessive and degenerate genetics. And of course, they've convinced themselves that being an expression of our recessive genetics is somehow a form of diversity and something worth fighting for, right? You know what I'm saying? We will always be able to produce people that look like the European, which means he is not a race. We will always be able to produce blonde hair, blue eyes, red hair. I'm saying he's just a particular population of humanity that only has recessive genetics in his genome. A sister by the name of Lashe For You made a beautiful video series called The Egyptians Were Burnt Caucasians, where she spoke about how the European brands the East Africans as being Caucasoid or Caucasian, no matter how dark their skin may be or how nappy the hair may be, they're still branded as being Caucasoid. Because like I said, the word Caucasoid is a psychological trigger and a brand and a way to colonize the subconscious mind. Let's use Akhenaten for example. When someone says that Akhenaten's facial features look or appear to be Caucasian or Caucasoid, the subconscious mind of someone who is ignorant will begin to create or conjure up scenarios that someplace in Akhenaten's family tree he has been mixed with Caucasian. I'm saying this is how these people get away with saying that the ancient Egyptians look like these modern day Octoroon and Quintroon Egyptians and Arabs. And even more devastating, since the subconscious mind associates Caucasian with European and also being white, their subconscious mind will attempt to see a relationship between the European and the ancient Egyptians. So and that's why they made the that artificial bust of King Tut, Akhenaten's son, where they bleached his skin and made him look more like the modern Egyptians instead of how the ancients depicted him. And to go along with that, they even performed one of those fake DNA tests that said King Tut was related to more than half of all European men alive today, right? You know what I'm saying? All attempts by the European to mark his territory on the globe, but also in our subconscious minds. I want to use a quick analogy to illustrate what I mean real quick. You know what I'm saying? Something everybody can relate to. The European is to the East African and original Indians what a pair of bootleg Air Jordans are to a pair of authentic Air Jordans. Right? Let's say Nike is the original man, ancient and primordial. Right? Air Jordan is a part of Nike, just like how the East Africans and Indians are part of the original man. The European is a fake bootleg pair of Air Jordans, a poorly manufactured bootleg at that, right? When the European brands phenotypes like having thin lips, blue eyes, and blonde hair as being exclusively Caucasoid, it's like if I was a manufacturer of bootleg Air Jordans. It's like me attempting to tell Nike that I own the copyright and trademark for Air Jordan just because my bootleg and poorly manufactured fake Air Jordans appear to resemble the authentic and original Air Jordans. Even though Nike, the original man, created the Air Jordan first, just like we had all phenotypes first. You see what I'm saying? It's just, the word Caucasoid is just a brand with no basis in reality whatsoever. Just to speak more about this nonsense of classifying people with artificial colors before I move on, you can look up what are known as skin tone or Pantone charts and clearly see that there is absolutely no human beings whose skin tones are actually white, red, yellow, or what we think is black, right? And in modern times, why is it that people who are branded as Latinos, who were once branded as red, are now known as being the brown race, when most humans are shades of brown, excluding albinos and extremely pale-skinned Europeans, of course? I'm saying, even if you was to point out individuals who actually had white, black, red, and yellow skin tones, being that those colors are only adjectives that describe those individuals, I'm saying you can never group millions of people under adjectives that don't even describe their skin tone. You see what I'm saying? We've been taught to assume that everybody on the continent of Africa is just extremely dark skinned, which is false. I'm saying all people on the continent of Africa are different shades of brown because we have a large variety of skin tones. Let's use a so-called blackamoor for example. That color isn't even black to begin with, which is why I'm going to speak about the true definition of black. But you know what I'm saying, you can be hard pressed to actually find me a human being that is actually that skin tone. I'm saying those so-called blackamoors are simply representations of the darkest moors. I'm saying everybody is not that dark. Even if you could find a human being that is that dark, My skin tone is a shade of brown, just like most people's on the planet. So like I said before, you can never use an adjective that only describes certain individuals to describe millions of people who don't fit that description. You can't classify race using a few colors, because you can't classify phenotypes, because we have all phenotypes and skin tones. You know what I'm saying? It's just basic common sense. Walter Plecker is also another eugenicist who played a major role in classifying the true Americans as blacks, Negroes, and coloreds. In 1924, he created the Act to Preserve Racial Integrity of Virginia that classified people as either white or coloreds and made it a crime for so-called non-whites to marry so-called whites. So he used what we would call the one-drop rule, where unless you was, for lack of a better term, a pure European, you would be considered a mongrel and could not be classified as white and would be classified as Negro, black, or colored. So all indigenous Americans, whether they were the stereotypical Native Americans who we are taught about in schools today, or whether they were the darker skinned Olmecan natives who are now labeled as African Americans, all of them were branded as Negroes, blacks, and coloreds by Plecker. So Walter Plecker basically took birth certificates and marriage documents, and people who were once classified as Indians were being rewritten and branded as coloreds and Negroes. Alright, so before I end part 1 of this video series, I'm going to quickly and easily prove to everyone that race and color are indeed social statuses and have nothing to do with skin tone. A caste system where white is always on top and black is always at the bottom. Alright, so we have to remember that during the 1800s and 1900s, when immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were coming to North America, they were not classified as whites. I'm saying this is basic information that anyone can research. Sicilians, Italians, Greeks, Eastern Europeans like the Polish and the Russians, also the Irish, none of these people were being classified as white. Most of these immigrants were Catholics or Jews. So the people who were descendants of the first European invaders of North America, who were born in America, were Christian Protestants and proclaimed themselves to be natives, which started the nativist movement against immigrants. It was anti-Catholic or anti-anything that aided immigrants from Europe. Pretty much the exact same shit that's going on today with these pale-skinned Europeans who were born in the so-called U.S., who hate Mexicans and want to label them as illegal immigrants, when in reality those Mexicans who are coming over here are indigenous to the land, unlike these pale-skinned Europeans who are actually living here illegally. So you can watch movies like Gangs of New York, or even the documentary called The Real Gangs of New York, that speaks about how these immigrants had to live in poverty due to them being at a very low status, which of course led to crime, gang activity, so on. So basically the Europeans who were part of the nativist movement were in fear of losing jobs to immigrants who would work for less. The same thing that's going on today. They were in fear of other religious organizations other than Christianity coming into power. The immigrants had to work the most horrible and dangerous jobs for the least amount of pay. And another reason why many of the immigrants, like Italians, Sicilians, Southern Europeans, weren't classified as white is because they weren't considered to be pure Europeans. And it's partially true, because we all remember the one scene from what's the movie, True Romance, where the cop was in a chair and he told the Sicilian mobsters that they were part eggplant, they were spawned by niggers, and he told them how the Moors conquered Sicily. And that's also true for the Mediterranean Jews. Many of the Jews who were killed in Europe were swarthy or tawny because they were mixed with the blood of Moors, like the Sicilian, Spaniards, Italians, and Greeks. And to go along with being mixed with Moorish blood, plus the fact that they were Catholics and immigrants, they were hated by so-called pure Europeans, right? Something very interesting that you can do yourself is simply type the word Sicilians in a Google Images, and what will pop up under the suggestions is not white and Moors. I'm saying very interesting, isn't it? Google basically switched the format a little bit, so I don't know if you can still, if this will still work for you, but I saved a screenshot of it before they switched the format. You know what I'm saying? These people know that they are not white because white is a social status and not a color or a race. I actually had first-hand experience with this subject because I was always interested in the subject of race. I had a conversation with an Italian kid when I was like how old was I? I was like a freshman in high school, like 7 or 8 years ago. And this Italian dude basically told me out of his own mouth that Italians are not white. You know what I'm saying? He wasn't even like a Southern Italian or Sicilian neither. I mean, he didn't have like blonde hair or blue eyes, but I thought he was just a regular pale-skinned European. And then it all had to do with the fact that his great-great-grandparents came here from Italy, and they were not granted with the status of white. Of course, his grandparents passed this fact down through the generations that they weren't white to him. And, you know what I'm saying, my ignorant ass being so mentally enslaved, my mind couldn't even compute or comprehend what he was saying, because just like these African Americans and these people who love being black, I thought that being white had something to do with skin tone. It doesn't. Like, it has nothing to do with skin tone at all. It's the same exact story with the Irish. They were immigrants and Catholics who were seen as a threat to these Europeans who were part of the nativist movement. Just like the Sicilians, the Eastern Europeans, Irish weren't classified as white. They were depicted as thugs, savages, hideous creatures. All propaganda to create fear, hatred, and to validate putting these people into subhuman status. I'm saying you can look at the artwork depicting the Irish as apes and subhumans, just like how we were depicted as apes and subhuman. European immigrants like the Irish were also being branded as coloreds and Negroes. I found a very informative article titled "Colored Me," where a man's Irish great-great-grandfather and his wife were classified as coloreds by Walter Plecker. It says, "This is a marriage license of my great-great-grandfather, born in Ireland in 1854 and married to a Virginian native in 1884. His race, you'll notice, is given as colored. Since when are Irishmen colored?" I'm saying exactly because it's a social status with no basis in reality. You can see the full certificate where Patrick O'Malley and his wife are branded as coloreds, and it also says reported by John H. Powell, who was one of Walter Plecker's partners in preserving the so-called white race, and who also formed the Anglo-Saxon Clubs of America. And if you scroll down, you can obviously see that his great-great-grandparents are Europeans, and that his great-great-grandmother was only a native in the sense that she was born in Virginia. She is not an indigenous or autochthonous American. And the author concludes that I can reasonably conclude that Plecker or one of his clerks simply decided that Patrick O'Malley, being Irish, was not white, and that Hester, my father knew her as Esther, Holland, must have been the product of some tangled skein of intermarriage that made her also non-white in the state's eyes. Very interesting, isn't it? More information about the Europeans being branded as colors and Negroes. I'm going to read from J.A. Rogers' 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro, pages 19 and 44. Alright. 19. Number 67. White children were kidnapped in the British Isles at the rate of several thousands yearly in the 17th and 18th centuries and sold into slavery in America and the West Indies. Sometimes they were bootlegged and sold as Negroes. White Americans, North and South, were also kidnapped or seduced and sold as Negroes as late as 1859. One of the most celebrated cases of a white person sold as a Negro was Sally Muller, who was held in servitude in Louisiana for 26 years. Court after court ruled against her. Finally, her birth certificate was dug up in Germany, and she was freed by the Supreme Court in 1818. Alright, going to page 44, number 67. For the sale of white people as Negro slaves, see article from Cincinnati Philanthropist, reprinted in Colored American, June 20th, 1840, where a white woman was sold as a Negro, and where her 10 children by 2 of her white masters were also sold as Negroes. J.A. Rogers, 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro. And then you have the situation in South Africa where people who were ethnically Chinese, right, so-called yellow people, being reclassified as blacks to gain basically affirmative action benefits only awarded to people classified as blacks. The Chinese Association of South Africa sued the government because they said that the ethnic Chinese were being discriminated against and were not receiving certain job opportunities because, get this, the Chinese were actually classified as whites. So yellow people can also be white as well. You know what I'm saying? That's strange, ain't it? But like I said, these opportunities were basically affirmative action like we have in the so-called US, where only those who are branded as blacks, minorities, impoverished can benefit and attempt to end. It's an attempt to end discrimination, but really is to keep you comfortable in your lower social status so you can depend on the government for the rest of your life. And during the era of apartheid, the Chinese of South Africa were classified as being mixed race or coloreds. The site says white still on top. Our correspondent says the ruling provides clarity for corporations in South Africa on the rights of their Chinese staff who were declared colored under apartheid but are generally regarded as white today. A study released last month revealed that white South Africans still earn around 450% more than their black counterparts 14 years after the end of apartheid, which basically means the Chinese who choose to be branded as blacks are actually better off allowing themselves to be branded as whites. You know what I'm saying? There's no long-term benefit to being branded as blacks, even if they see those affirmative action benefits given to blacks as being a benefit. It's only temporary, and as they just stated, whites still make 450% more than blacks. And then we have the situation with Mustafa Hefni, who was an immigrant to the so-called United States from Egypt in 1978. And this brother been fighting for like 30 years to be black when he migrated to North America. When he came here, his social status was white. He made the mistake of believing that fighting to be black was fighting to preserve his African heritage, and he had no idea that he was basically, excuse my language, he was basically fucking himself over, because he had no clue that being white and black are social statuses and have nothing to do with actual skin tone, heritage, culture, or history, etc., etc. I'm saying he thought he was doing the right thing, and I guess it's a commendable effort, but in reality, this is why you can't convince any of these so-called African Americans to stop calling themselves black, because just like Mr. Hefni, they have been taught to believe that being black is an identity that we came up with and is an identity that's worth fighting for and protecting. I'm saying it's always been a false identity created by the European. He attempted to sue the US for not being allowed to be branded as black. With his efforts to become black, he missed out on financial opportunities like jobs. He was shunned by his co-workers, and his life basically became a living hell due to all this. I'm saying I feel bad for the man because he had no clue what he was doing, but he thought he was doing the right thing, but emotions and beliefs mean absolutely nothing, right? I'm saying as for all you blacks and African Americans in the conscious community, you have absolutely no excuse to still believe black is an identity, because the proof is out there, but you don't want to use logic or reasoning. I'm saying if all of this doesn't prove to you why being branded as colors and races is nothing more than social status and a way for the European to colonize the planet in our minds, then you are clearly a lost individual with no hope. You know what I'm saying? How are the Irish some of the palest skinned people on the planet, yet they actually had to become white and were oftentimes being branded as Negroes and colors? How is this possible if race and color have any basis in reality and have to do with skin tone, right? Why did other Europeans like Italians, Sicilians, Eastern Europeans have to also become white if there was already such a thing as a white race? How is it possible that Europeans could also be branded as Negroes and coloreds? I'm saying, why are Chinese, the so-called yellow people, able to become black if black was actually a race and a people, an identity? So to all you conscious community and RBG dudes, you know what I'm saying, you just gonna let yellow people steal y'all's identities as a black man and woman? I'm saying you just gonna let the Chinese steal y'all's history? know what I'm saying? Why is like people like Mustafa Hefny, who clearly is not a pale-skinned European, a man with woolly hair, why is he able to be branded as white? You know what I'm saying? It's ridiculous. Like I said, do your own research about the history of race and color, and you will see that the European was always the one giving us these false identities called races and colors. We never in history called ourselves black, just like we never called the Europeans white. Alright, in part two, I'm gonna quickly speak about the difference between race or color versus your ethnicity, nationality, cultural group, etc. I'm gonna also speak about the classification of so-called mixed race people in the so-called United States versus their classification in Africa and places branded as being Caucasoid geographically. I'm gonna dispel this nonsense of there being such a thing as a white Moor or a white Arab, and I'm gonna also speak about some of these places that supposedly mean black. Like, you know how some people will say Bilad al Sudan, Guinea, Kemet, how all these places mean land of the blacks. You know, I'm gonna dispel that BS real quick. I'm gonna also give you absolute proof that you should never use the word black to describe yourself with the true definition of black, and I'm gonna give people alternatives to the word black because I comprehend that that color that we erroneously call black is sacred to us. And if I have time, I'm going to briefly speak about the psychology of why people call themselves blacks and why they hold on to these and defend these fake identities. I'm not sure how many parts I'm going to do, probably 3 or 4 parts total, but please stick around because I have some extremely valuable book sources about the Moors that proves how ancient we are and our connection to all continents and all ancient cultures like the Persians, Chaldeans, Babylonians, Egyptians. And of course I'm going to speak about how DNA actually proves that we are indigenous to the Americas while debunking African American DNA testing. Alright, so thanks for watching and stay tuned and peace to you all. Thanks.